In 2021, Abe was dumped by his long-term girlfriend. The experience left him pretty bruised up, but after a while he decided to get back out there and start dating again. Abe was more on the shy side, and so he wasn't the best at asking girls out. He wasn't exactly sure why, but either way, it wasn't his strong suit. When Abe had met his ex 6 years earlier, Tinder and other dating apps were just becoming popular, so online dating was pretty unfamiliar to him. But now he was single, and so he was pretty excited to try it out for the first time. He had a few friends that had found success on dating apps, and so he was pretty optimistic. But after a few months of using Tinder, he realized online dating wasn't at all what he thought it would be. He only managed to meet up with one girl at a park, and after 20 minutes, she played the classic phone call move, claiming she had gotten called into work. As you can probably guess, he never heard back from her again. He was about to call it and just give up on dating apps completely when he got matched with a girl named Danny. She was a really pretty girl who he knew was way out of his league and had a sneaking suspicion that he was being catfished or played by one of his friends. He'd heard many stories of catfishing, and at one point he thought for sure Danny was going to be some 50-year-old dude. But because he didn't have many other options, and he was thrilled at the small possibility of Danny being who she said she was, he continued to talk to her anyway. They talked for a few days and finally agreed to meet at a local park, which Abe thought would be a perfect spot for a first date. There was this big lake in the middle and a series of trails that went all around the lake, which he thought would be pretty romantic. They agreed to meet up at 5 p.m. when the both of them had gotten off of work. A little after 5, she messaged him saying she was walking to the pavilion where all the picnic tables were. He looked over to his left out of his car window, and sure enough, there was the girl from the Tinder pictures. She was actually real. A newfound nervousness knowing that she was actually real, Abe got out of the car and walked up to her. They were able to talk for a few hours and actually had some pretty good chemistry between the two of them. Abe honestly couldn't believe he was pulling it off. Later that evening, as their talk was starting to wrap up, they decided to go for a walk on one of the trails, not wanting to end the date, and even though it was starting to get dark out, they decided to do it. Normally, Abe would never have agreed to walk in the dark with a stranger he had just met online. But he felt calm with Danny for some reason. He trusted her. They even held hands, and for the first time since he had been dumped, Abe felt something special. They walked for a long time along the lake until it was pretty much completely dark, at which point Danny suggested that they turn around and start making their way back to the parking lot. For the first few minutes, the walk back was perfect. They had a few more good conversations, and it felt like the chemistry was continuing to grow. However, that's when things took a turn for the worse. They weren't far from the parking lot when Abe noticed what looked like a man standing in the walkway, just watching them from a distance. The guy was just standing there, which obviously wasn't normal, and he could barely see him from the distance, so he started to wonder if it was just his imagination. He didn't say anything to Danny at first, but as they got closer, with the help of the faint light of the moon shining through the trees, he realized it was a person. Danny froze before Abe could say anything, and that's when he asked her if she could see the man, and she said that she could. That's when Danny shouted at the man and asked him if he needed anything, but the man just continued to stand there, staring at them. Abe was a bit taken aback by this, thinking they should just sneak away rather than make some giant scene about it. He thought this would put them at a better chance of being attacked, but he also didn't want to seem too scared in front of Danny. He tried to write off the whole thing as some idiot trying to play a joke on them, doing his best to hide the fear in his voice as he also yelled out. Danny reluctantly nodded towards the man, ensuing that they should keep going. And so Abe did so. He walked with her. He continued to pray that the man was just playing a joke on them, or that he would just turn around and leave them alone. But the guy didn't move at all. To make matters worse, they could now clearly see that he was concealing something behind his back. When they were about 10 feet away from him, the man finally moved his hands from behind his back and pointed a hunting knife at them. In a low and rough voice, he commanded them to turn around and put their hands above their head. Abe sort of froze up, not realizing the reality of the situation he was in. He honestly had no clue what to do. He had never been robbed before, and at that moment, he knew he was in very real danger. And that's when he suspected Danny of setting him up. He kind of looked over at her and wondered if she really could be behind this. However, that thought quickly left his head when Danny started to aggressively argue with the guy. Before Abe could even process what was happening, she started running at the armed man. Right before she reached him, she kind of threw her body at him and managed to knock him over. As soon as the man hit the ground face up, she shouted for Abe to run. Abe, kinda now even more taken aback by what he was seeing, just stood there, but finally started to run. He didn't want to leave Danny alone, but he didn't really need much more convincing. A couple of seconds later, Danny managed to get up and caught up to Abe. They could both clearly hear the man running after them as they made their way off the trail and sort of down this shortcut towards the parking lot. As soon as they got there, they both threw themselves into Danny's car and drove off, not even checking if there was anyone behind them as they pulled out of the parking lot. As they picked up speed and were starting to actually drive off, Abe looked in his rearview mirror. That's when he saw the man with the knife in his hand still standing there. He was standing alone in the parking lot, again just staring at them as they drove off. Another thing they did notice is that there were other cars in the parking lot at the time of leaving. There were 3 other ones. This made them think that the guy may have had other accomplices with him. When they were a safe distance away, they called the police and reported what had just happened. The cops arrived at the scene pretty quickly, but the man was long gone, and the only car left in the lot now was Abe's. After they gave their statements to the cops and they left the area, they decided to go on a late-night dinner and stayed up all night talking about what had just happened. It was almost like the shared sense of danger from the incident had brought them closer in some way, and despite his horror, Abe decided to just go with it. Fast forward to 2 years later, and Abe and Danny are now engaged. Whenever they're asked about how they met, they always have a laugh at people's reactions when they tell them that they met on Tinder and almost got killed on their first date. In 2017, Alex downloaded Tinder for the first time in his life. Because he never had much success with women and he didn't consider himself too attractive, he figured he might as well try his luck with dating apps. As is often the case for average-looking guys in online dating, Alex initially didn't get a lot of attention from the kind of girls he wanted to meet up with. But things took a turn when pretty soon he got a message from a pretty blonde girl named Katie. At first, Alex assumed she was either a bot or a catfisher, as she was by far the most attractive girl who had ever paid him any real attention on the app. Being that it was his first time on the app, he didn't know entirely how to act. I mean, on the one hand, if Katie was a real girl, he didn't want to screw things up with her by ghosting her. But on the other hand, he didn't want to entertain any bot or walk into any obvious trouble. After overthinking for several hours, Alex finally decided to just ignore the text, frustrated by his unexciting introduction to online dating. But unlike most bots who usually don't message people more than once after being ignored, Katie reached out to him once again just 3 days later. In the back of his mind, he was still a little bit suspicious, but he was strongly considering the possibility that Katie was a real person. And after taking a more in-depth look at her profile, he decided to give her a chance and texted her back, thinking what's the worst that could happen. Against all expectations, Alex and Katie hit it off immediately, like to the point where they were messaging each other pretty much every day. Having that nagging feeling in the back of his mind that she actually wasn't real the entire time, he finally asked her to prove she was real by having a video call. And she had no problem doing that. Fast forward a couple of weeks and they were having phone conversations and video calls all the time. It was pretty much clear that Katie was a real person. After talking with Alex on Tinder for about a month, Katie suggested that Alex should go and visit her. Even though he trusted her by this point, he was still hesitant to meet up with a girl he met up online, especially considering the fact that they were 8 hours apart. But Katie continued to insist, and after weighing all his options, Alex finally accepted, figuring he could take off a day or two to go see if they actually had any in-person chemistry. When the day came, he was nervous, but the last thing he wanted to do was cancel on her. So he started to drive to Katie's place. However, not long into it, he started to notice something was a little off. She messaged him almost compulsively to ask him where it was and how long until he was going to be there. Even though she must have known Alex was driving, whenever he took more than half an hour to respond, she would spam him with texts, insisting he check his phone more often. It threw him off a bit, of course, but Alex was nervous, and so he chalked it up to her being nervous as well. He kept driving, and as he got closer to the location Katie had given him, he realized it was going to be harder than he thought to find the house. The directions were pretty confusing, and he had to drive through a series of gravel roads surrounded by thick trees to get to the location. Every road kind of just looked the same. After driving around in probably multiple circles for what felt like hours, he finally made it to Katie's at about 2 p.m. He was immediately surprised by how old the house looked. There was a boarded-up window on the second floor, and the building looked like it had seen better days for sure. Still, he caught a glimpse of the red buggy that Katie loved to talk about over text, and feeling slightly comforted, he parked right in front of the garage. He texted her that he was there, and Katie replied with a single smiley face. It was a bit weird, but he figured that was the go-ahead to get out of the car and finally knock on the door, so he did so. And that's when he noticed an older guy staring down at him from one of the second-floor windows. The drive there had already been pretty strange, but this was by far the creepiest thing that had happened to him ever since he left his house. Still, he did remember one time over the phone how Katie had talked about her dad and how he would sometimes visit her, and he assumed the man on the second floor must have been him. Again, going back to feeling nervous, he finally knocked on the front door, where Katie appeared a few seconds later, inviting him in with a warm smile. Even though he FaceTimed her multiple times, so he pretty much already knew she was real, after all the things that had happened, he was pretty relieved to actually see her in person. She gave him a hug, and he breathed a bit of a sigh of relief. They talked for a little while, and that's when Alex asked her why she hadn't told him about her dad being there that day. Katie's face instantly showed confusion, and she responded that her dad was halfway across the country and wasn't planning on visiting for at least a few weeks. As far as she knew, she was home alone. Thinking she was obviously just trying to scare him now, Alex kind of rolled his eyes and explained how he had seen her dad looking at him through the second-floor window when he got out of his car. That's when Katie's face turned an obvious pale color, and she whispered to Alex that they had to leave the house immediately. Surprised by the seriousness of her reaction, his heart kind of fell to the bottom of his chest, realizing they might be in serious danger. They went out the front door and got a good view of the house a good distance away, and that's when Alex begged for an explanation. According to Katie, she wasn't expecting any other visitors, and she didn't know who the old man was or how he had even gotten in. Alex called the police as Katie was sort of standing behind him. That's when he heard her kind of gasp and point up at the second-floor window. There again was the old man looking down at them. He looked sort of old and frail, as if he hadn't eaten in several days. As soon as he noticed that he had been noticed, he sort of backed away, slowly disappearing into the darkness of the rest of the house and out of view from Katie and Alex. Pretty terrified from the sight, the two of them got into Alex's car, where they locked the doors and waited for police to arrive. They didn't want to fully leave the premises because they wanted to be there when the police arrived, but they also wanted some sort of safety to protect them if any sort of danger came their way from this man. 2 police officers arrived about 30 minutes later. They happily searched the entire house from top to bottom. However, they didn't find anything, except the back door hanging wide open, but the man himself was nowhere to be seen inside the house. The cops couldn't really do anything at that point, so they kind of just told the two to go back inside and make sure all the doors and windows are locked and to call them back if anything else happened. They left, and Katie, pretty understandably, was too scared to spend the night alone, and so Alex agreed to stay with her downstairs on the couch to avoid going to the second floor. Katie explained how her dad owned a shotgun, and so the two of them grabbed it and put it by their side as they sat there. They sort of tried to fall asleep, and a couple hours later, Katie actually managed to do so. But Alex sort of felt an obligation to protect her, and so he remained awake watching TV with the shotgun now on his lap. Ever since the cops had left, the night was going pretty peacefully, and Alex, kind of forgetting about what had all happened, he even thought he might still have a chance with Katie the next day. But at around 2 a.m., Alex started to hear the sound of a doorknob being turned in the upstairs kitchen. Horrified, he tightened his grip on the shotgun, determined to scare away whoever was trying to get into the house. He slowly walked up the stairs to the kitchen, where he turned on a light so his presence would be known. He pointed the shotgun at the door that was making the noise, and to his horror, on the other side of the glass door, he saw the same frail-looking old man from earlier that afternoon. For a guy who was blatantly breaking and entering, the man looked shocked to see Alex, but after a couple of seconds, he turned around and ran off into the woods once again. He immediately went downstairs to wake up Katie and told her what had happened, and called the cops for the second time that day. Again, they took about 30 minutes to arrive, and this time, instead of searching just the house, they also searched the surrounding woods. However, the old man again was nowhere to be found. All they could do this time was suggest to Katie and Alex to go sleep somewhere else for the night, as obviously this house was not safe. Realistically, Alex realized that they probably should have done this after the first time of seeing him, but he was kind of just going along with Katie. Obviously, he realized this wasn't the best first date, but he was just happy that the two of them were okay. The cops left, and so Alex and Katie sort of said their goodbyes, and Katie went to go spend the night at her friend's house. Alex hung around for a little while longer to call his brother and tell him about what had happened. A few minutes later, sitting in his car on the phone with his brother and about to pull away, he saw someone move out of the corner of his eye. He noticed it was the same old man standing in front of the house watching him. He put the pedal to the floor and told his brother what was happening, sort of as it was happening. After he got off the phone with his brother, he debated calling Katie and telling her what had happened. He didn't really want to, knowing that it might scare her, but ultimately he decided he probably should. Although he did end up going on a couple of dates with Katie after that, he said he never fully got over the incident, and they eventually broke things off. According to Alex, Katie never went back to that house alone. In 2015, Ryan Nolan was 20 years old and was enjoying all that Tinder had to offer. Aside from the occasional bad date where he got stood up or just didn't connect with the girl he met up with, he was pretty happy with the way things were going for him on the app overall. One weekend in the winter, he made plans to visit some friends at Indiana University in Bloomington. Just to hang out, go out, and have fun. The first night he was there, everything went according to plan, and Ryan had a blast partying with his buddies. At some point during the weekend, he figured he might as well get on Tinder to try and meet up with a cute girl in Bloomington and see where things went. Like usual for Ryan, it didn't take long for him to get a match, and after talking to this girl named Jane for a little less than a day, they started making plans to meet up that same evening. Jane was pretty attractive and fun to talk to, so he thought, why not? After letting his friends know he was going to meet up with his Tinder date, he left the apartment and made the 5-minute drive to her place. As soon as he got to the building, he texted Jane in the app and asked her which door he was supposed to go in. He waited for her to respond as he sat in his car, but soon realized that was kind of stupid, and so he got out of his car and started walking around the complex to hopefully give her an idea of where he was, and maybe he'd see her outside her door. After a while, as he was walking, Jane finally responded, and Ryan finally could walk to the right door. He stepped in front of it and texted her back to meet him at the door and let him in, assuming the door would be locked. Keep in mind, it was about 10 p.m. in the dead of winter. He looked back and forth from his phone screen to see if she responded, back to the door to see if she was answering it. That's when he noticed movement from the corner of his eye coming from one of the windows. He took a better look and saw what looked like 4 different people looking at him through the blinds. He thought it was pretty creepy, but he also didn't know that window was to Jane's specific apartment. It could have been one of her neighbors or something, and he also wasn't in the best part of town, so he kind of just brushed it off. He again texted Jane to ask her where she was. Less than a minute later, his phone dinged, and it was her replying that the front door to the complex was already open. He was kind of surprised that she would leave the door unlocked so late at night, especially in this part of town. He walked in and shut the door behind him. There was only one dim light, so he couldn't really see anything and was fidgeting around the wall looking for a light switch. Almost immediately, he heard a voice behind an apartment door whisper, "He's right outside the door." That's when he realized the window he saw outside was to Jane's apartment, it was just to a different room. He got a strong gut reaction telling him he was in danger, and he quickly sprinted out of the complex. Now running, he went to his car and hightailed it out of there as fast as he could. The whole way back, he couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened to him had he continued further, thinking some sort of Jane was actually in there. He was starting to realize that Jane probably didn't exist at all, and that thought alone sent shivers down his spine. When he got back to his friend's place, he explained everything to them about what had happened, but they ultimately didn't really take him that seriously and kind of assumed he was just overreacting about the whole thing. A little later that evening, they went and got a few beers, and right before he went to bed, he got an ominous text from Jane saying, "Where did you go? I've been waiting for you all night." Immediately, he blocked the number and went to sleep. He never found out who exactly was waiting for him in that apartment, but if one thing's for sure, he knew it wasn't a girl named Jane. In 2019, Sabrina matched with a guy on Tinder named Nick, who she thought was really cute. Because she'd had plenty of good experiences using dating apps in the past, her guard was a little down, and she rarely let her friends know what she was doing, who she was with, or where she was. For the first couple of dates with this guy, they went to get coffee or on walks outside. After about 2 weeks of dating, Sabrina decided she really liked Nick. He was friendly, good-looking, he was funny, he had his life together, and they also had great chemistry together. For their third date, Nick suggested that Sabrina should come over to his place to have some wine. Feeling safe and comfortable enough to be alone with this guy at this point, Sabrina agreed. When the night of their date finally came, she went over to Nick's house, excited to get to know him even better. The two joked around for a bit and started talking like on their previous dates. After a while, Nick poured her a glass of wine. At this point, Sabrina thought things were going really well, and she felt comfortable in his company. However, after a while, at about 8 p.m., Sabrina started feeling a little funny. She felt almost sleepy and a little weak. She had trouble stringing a sentence together. Now, in the past, Sabrina had been roofied once before at a college party, and so she immediately recognized the effects as soon as they kicked in. But at the exact same time, now realizing the danger of the situation she was in, she pretended she was feeling fine. From her past experience, she knew she only had a few minutes before she passed out and was left vulnerable and at the mercy of this man that she thought she could trust. She knew she had to do something, and so at around 8:15, Sabrina told Nick as quickly and energetically as possible that she needed to use the bathroom, trying her best to make it seem as if nothing was off. Fortunately, Nick didn't seem to notice anything strange about her behavior, and once she was inside the bathroom, she locked the door immediately and called the police. As Sabrina sat there, her surroundings starting to blur, she told them that she had been drugged and that they needed to come get her out before something terrible happened. Less than a minute after giving the cops Nick's address and hanging up the phone, she was completely out. But because she was still under the effects of the drug, she felt herself slide in and out of consciousness during this time. All she remembers is the police putting a bag over her head as they carried her out of the bathroom and into the patrol car. Following this entire incident, Sabrina was understandably traumatized, but at that point she wasn't even aware of how badly things could have ended for her had she not reacted as quickly as she did. A few days later, she received a call from the police asking her to come down to the station to give her statement. Once there, she mentioned to the cops that the only thing she remembered clearly was that they had put a bag over her head, but that she could have imagined it due to the effects of the drug. As soon as she said this, the cops looked at each other uncomfortably and confessed that they had indeed put a bag over her head. Sabrina looked at them, kinda confused. They quickly explained that it was actually to protect her. When they walked into the apartment, they saw that Nick had set up something extremely disturbing for her in the living room, and that seeing it would have been too traumatizing for Sabrina. She immediately felt a shiver go down her spine. Because Nick was thrown in jail following the incident, she never found out what exactly he had prepared for her. However, she kinda sees this as a good thing. After this whole nightmare, Sabrina deleted Tinder and vowed never to go back to online dating again. When he was 21, Taylor had just gotten dumped by his girlfriend and had also recently become a police officer. As a 21-year-old new cop, he had this sort of I'm invincible and I can take on anyone mentality. So when he downloaded Tinder and matched with a good-looking girl named Brianna, who was way out of his league, he assumed things would go great for him. After getting to know her a while on Tinder, they finally set up a date to meet. Brianna had mentioned our house had this great open field to sort of just look at the stars, hang out, and talk, and she offered for it to be their first date location. Taylor thought it was as good a spot as any and agreed. When the night came for them to meet, he was pretty excited to pick her up, and she seemed pretty excited as well as she got into his car. As she guided him to the field, Taylor knew it was going to be a great night. They had lucked out with the weather, and there were a ton of stars out. And it was this huge, peaceful open space with some nice woods, there were deer, and there were even other wildlife visible in the distance. It was the textbook perfect spot for a first date. However, as soon as Taylor parked the car, he noticed some really dim headlights in the distance. It looked like a van, but he wasn't entirely sure. When the vehicle got closer, he confirmed that it was a van, and he was a bit confused thinking they were the only ones on the property. As the van got closer, it didn't look like it was stopping, and it was in perfect head-on collision line with the parked car they were in. But as it got closer, it finally hit the brakes and stopped almost headlight to headlight with their parked car. It pretty much blocked Taylor's car from moving forward at all. Brianna seemed to have a confused look on her face, and so assuming she didn't know who it was, he kind of prepared for the worst and told her to stay in the car while he went to see what was going on. He grabbed his flashlight and walked up to the van, where he saw a pretty big dude sitting in the driver's seat. Sort of angrily at this point, he asked him what was going on and if he could back up his car a little bit. Surprisingly, the man was actually really polite, and in a low, kind voice, he said he was the owner of the property and didn't mean to scare them at all. According to the man who introduced himself as Bob, he had been having trouble with poachers on his property and just wanted to make sure Taylor and Brianna weren't going to be shooting at the deer or hurting any of the other animals on the property. Taylor, a bit taken aback by this, lowered his voice to a more calm level. He smiled politely and assured him that they only came out to look at the stars and the wildlife. Bob seemed to be pretty happy with his explanation, and a few seconds later he wished them a nice evening and drove away. Taylor, pretty happy with how he had handled things, went back to his car ready to enjoy his first date. However, now Brianna, for whatever reason, didn't seem to be on the same page, and he noticed something very off about her behavior. Instead of actually talking to him and enjoying the date like they were just before, she was now texting non-stop, and when Taylor asked her who she was talking to, she refused to answer. He thought it was pretty weird, but he chalked it up to her nervousness or whatever and tried his best to strike up a fun conversation with her. About an hour later, he saw the same headlights coming towards them again, this time at a much faster pace than before. Feeling that he and his date were now in serious danger, he hopped in his truck and moved to a more defensive position. After the van screeched to a stop inches away from Taylor's car, even closer than before, Brianna jumped out of the truck and ran towards the van. Taylor at first was sort of confused, thinking why she would run to this van that seems to be a threat to them. However, that's when Taylor realized he had been set up. Thinking quickly, he got out of his truck and commanded them to get on the ground. Obviously, though, neither Brianna or who he now realized was Bob complied. To Taylor's horror, Bob then charged at him and knocked him on the ground. Using all of his strength, Taylor managed to get up on his back and get up before Bob could grab him again. Everything was happening too quickly for him to process, but he knew he had to do something quickly or something really messed up would happen to him. That's when he saw Brianna, who a second ago he trusted, grab the metal pipe from Bob's van. She sort of shouted at him that they had a gun, but that if he gave them all his money and his truck, he would walk away unharmed. Now, again, Taylor had this sort of I'm invincible kind of mindset, and so he refused, to which Brianna started to cry, saying that she didn't want to hurt him if she didn't have to. When he saw Bob run back to the van, he finally revealed to them he was a cop, and he drew his concealed gun and commanded them to get on the ground. After a moment of shock, they finally complied, and Taylor scrambled to call 911. Just as he was telling dispatch that he had 2 suspects at gunpoint and needed backup immediately, Bob and Brianna got up and quickly started sprinting away into the darkness. Even though he knew it was a dumb choice at the time, Taylor initially started chasing them and ran into the woods around the field. The chase lasted maybe 30 seconds when Taylor heard 3 loud pops and saw a muzzle flash in the distance. Now feeling true panic for the first time that night, he sprinted back to his car and put the pedal to the metal until he was a safe distance away. Minutes later, he went back to the house where he picked up Brianna, called dispatch again, and asked the cops to come to that location. As soon as his sergeant and field training officer got there, obviously knowing who he was, they sort of gave him crap about having to call the cops when he really was the cops, he was just off duty. However, at the same time, they did recognize the seriousness of the situation and got in a patrol car and all drove down towards the field. To everyone's surprise, the van was still there. To Taylor's disappointment, his sergeant ordered him to stay in the car, keep his mouth shut, and only come out if they were getting shot at. Although the sergeant and training officer didn't find any sign of Bob or Brianna, they did find drugs in the center console of the car. But that wasn't all they found. When they came back to the patrol car, they weren't doing any more joking around, and the both of them looked pale and horrified at what they had just seen. They told Taylor to follow them back to the van, and after peering inside, he saw several knives, duct tape, lighter fluid, a decent amount of rifle ammo, handcuffs, and what looked to be dried blood. In the front passenger side, they found an AR-15 style rifle and 2 more handcuffs. The atmosphere obviously immediately changed as the 3 of them looked at each other wide-eyed. The team called for backup, and a few minutes later detectives arrived at the scene, which is where it was revealed that the plates were stolen and that the van had been reported stolen a few weeks prior to the incident. Taylor does still get picked on by his supervising officers about the incident to this day, but he's just happy no one got hurt. Since that night, he never went back to online dating again.